Hello everyone, it's Olivia here, aka Tremain, and I'm going to make another IGCSE video for, this video is going to be for the extract called Significant Cigarettes by Rose Tremain. I'm going to be looking down at my phone a lot because I've managed to find the sort of IGCSE book that has the extract on here. Possibly in your exam this extract will probably be much shorter than this one, but just to be on the safe side I'm going to read it all but go paragraph by paragraph, and I'm going to try and look at things like use of language, structure, stylistic devices, thoughts and feelings. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can in this video, and it's probably going to be a really long video, but that's the way it is. The first thing to mention, which I think is very significant, is that this Significant Cigarettes is I'm guessing a chapter, because it comes from The Road Home, which is a novel. So when you're reading this extract, it's really important to keep that fact in mind. So don't look at it as a short story if things feel vague or unclear. It could potentially be because this is the place in the novel where we're starting to learn more about the characters and their story and their motivations and what makes them tick. So whereas a short story is much more, you have a much short stories, you have a much shorter space to sort of develop characters, whereas novels are obviously fleshed out. So it's really important you know what form you're dealing with, because a form can have a massive impact on how a story is told. So obviously Significant Cigarettes is just a small section of this character's journey, and the character is called Lev. And I haven't actually read this yet because I think it's good if I go in blind. I can try and help you more and give you an idea of sort of how I start to unpick a text, rather than sort of having already formed my ideas. But I'm going to try and cover as much as I can with the techniques, but I'm just going to go paragraph by paragraph, and I'm just going to try and help you to the best of my ability. So here we go. On the coach, Lev chose a seat near the back, and he sat huddled against the window, staring out at the land he was leaving, at the fields of sunflowers scorched by the dry wind, at the pig farms, at the quarries and rivers, and at the wild garlic growing green at the edge of the road. Oh, okay. So, I don't know about you, but instantly, just reading that short paragraph, there's a great sort of poignancy, and poignancy means sad, like a very strong, sad emotion. There's a lot of poignancy throughout that paragraph. So Lev is completely on his own, even if he is surrounded by other passengers. You can gather from the fact that he's on the coach, but he's sitting at the back. Even like that choice to have the character sit at the back of the coach, and the verb huddled, so he's like trying to fold in on himself, almost like he's trying. It almost comes across as like, if you huddle, it can mean many different things. It can mean you might huddle if you're cold, but because he's sitting at the back, I'm thinking of huddled in terms of that action. He's trying to make himself almost seem invisible. He's trying to remain unnoticed, and he's clearly leaving his home, wherever he's come from, although we don't necessarily know where he's come from, but where he talks about staring out at the land he was leaving. And even the descriptions of the setting, like sunflowers, they're quite bright, vibrant flowers, and sunflowers can make you think of summer and positivity and optimism, and they can be seen as symbols for that. But it's the fact that they've been scorched by the dry wind that's sort of very harsh, and it kind of starts to build a picture that he's come from a very sort of rural location. And obviously there's like at the pig farms, at the quarries and rivers, and at the wild garlic growing green at the edge of the road. And that's a lovely use of like alliteration with the garlic growing green. So it's kind of like this idea that he's leaving almost this kind of very, possibly a very hard way of life, with like, if there's lots of farms and rural communities around, they probably don't have it necessarily easy, but it's the fact that he's leaving quite a sort of beautiful but harsh land behind. And you can start to build a picture that potentially one of the reasons why he is leaving is because it's too hard to make a living where he is. But obviously we don't know that for certain yet, but it's just starting to foreshadow and it's just starting to build up a picture. So this is the next paragraph. Lev wore a leather jacket and jeans and a leather cap pulled low over his eyes, and his handsome face was grey-toned from his smoking, and in his hands he clutched an old red cotton handkerchief and a dented pack of Russian cigarettes. That was a mouthful. There's no commas or anything in there. So he would soon be 43, and that's an amazing use of stylistic devices. So punctuation, I think in prose texts, a lot of students tend to overlook the fact that punctuation is incredibly important. So apart from the really short, snappy sentence at the end, like he would soon be 43, the long description of Lev has 0 commas. And because they mention the fact that he's got grey-toned skin from his smoking, because there are no commas, we can't take a breath. And obviously, if you smoke continuously, you get smoker's cough, and you get very breathless very easily. So that's almost placing us in Lev's position. Like, it's almost making us breathe like Lev. And the kind of description, it's very unassuming, and by that I mean he doesn't stand out as being anyone significant. He's not a very he doesn't have as a character, he doesn't have like a grand presence. Like, he's not one of those characters you would look at and think of, oh, that's the protagonist of a story. He's kind of very unassuming, and once again, even the way he's wearing his clothes, he's trying not to draw attention to himself. So he's got a leather cap that is pulled low over his eyes. He doesn't want to engage with anyone. He doesn't want to show eye contact. But it's interesting how it describes his handsome face was grey toned from his smoking. So it's almost like you overlook that he has this sort of handsome face that he's trying to cover up, but it's been grey toned from his smoking. And obviously he can't afford what's the word I'm looking for? He can't afford expensive attire, and attire is just another word for saying like your overall sort of clothes and appearance. And he has an old red cotton handkerchief and a dented packet of Russian cigarettes. So, and the fact that it's a dented pack of Russian cigarettes, it's a very old box that he obviously keeps with them. And because the name of the chapter is Significant Cigarettes, that kind of suggests that it has some kind of relevance or importance, but we don't know for certain yet what these cigarettes give him. So, and for the short, snappy sentence, he would soon be 43. He sounds like a very sort of down on his luck kind of character, especially with the grey toned skin. Like, that's a very powerful image that comes out at me, and it just makes me think that this man, he would soon be 43, but he's had like a very hard life. It doesn't sound like he's lived a very easy life. So this is the next paragraph. After some miles, as the sun came up, Lev took out a cigarette and stuck it between his lips, and the woman sitting next to him, a plump, contained person with moles like splashes of mud on her face, said quickly, "I'm sorry, but there is no smoking allowed on this bus." So it's quite interesting how we've got this stark contrast between Lev and this woman, and she's kind of made this assumption that Lev doesn't know that you're not allowed to smoke on a coach. And she's kind of just like, "I'm sorry, but there is no smoking allowed on this bus." And it's interesting how the way she's described is with moles like splashes of mud on her face. So there's a lot of rustic kind of imagery, and rustic is just another word that links to like the ideas of countryside, like a rustic lifestyle. It's very wholesome and down to earth and things like that. So it's interesting how even the way Lev perceives others is very rustic and very sort of down to earth. And the important thing to mention is that even though this is being narrated by a third person narrator, which means it's like an omniscient narrator who kind of is all knowing, all seeing, and is looking over the story. There's this thing, this is kind of going a bit advanced, but there's this thing called focalization, and I believe you have to spell it with a Z, because that's like the I can't remember who the theorist was, but there was a theorist who came up with focalization, and it's spelled with a Z. Focalization. And focalization is the viewpoint that a narrator can have, and the perspective of what a narrator can have. So even though this is not being narrated by Lev, because it's not in first person, post is coming through my door. The omniscient narrator is focalized in Lev's perspective. So that means Lev is seeing all these different people. We are seeing through Lev's eyes. There's a narrator who's telling us the story, but we are actually taking on Lev's perspective. So the fact that the woman, it mentions a person with moles like splashes of mud on her face, that is how that's the focalization of Lev. That is how Lev sees this woman potentially. So it's kind of just a different thing to think about. But don't worry if you don't understand what focalization is, because that's kind of like, wow, I don't even think I learned about it at college. I think it was like at uni, it was kind of like focalization. I was like, oh, what's this mean? So, but it's just to try and remember that even if a third person narrator is telling the story, it doesn't mean that we don't see like Lev's thoughts and feelings. We are seeing his thoughts and feelings. It's just that he himself is not telling his own story, and that can be significant as well. If there's a narrator who is telling Lev's story, that's almost taken away some of Lev's power, because he doesn't have the ability to be in a first person like narration. He doesn't get to say his story with his own words. So it's I find narrators and narration techniques very interesting, because they can develop so many different layers of meaning. Sorry, anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So this is the next bit. Lev knew this, had known it in advance, had tried to prepare himself mentally for the long agony of it, but even an unlit cigarette was a companion, something to hold on to, something that had promise in it, and all he could be bothered to do now was to nod, just to show the woman that he'd heard what she'd said, reassure her that he wasn't going to cause trouble, because there they would have to sit for 50 hours or more, side by side with their separate aches and dreams, like a married couple. They would hear each other's snores and sighs, smell the food and drink each had brought with them, note the degree to which each was fearful or unafraid, make short forays into conversation, and then later, when they finally arrived in London, they would probably separate with barely a word or a look, walk out into a rainy morning, each alone and beginning a new life, and Lev thought how all of this was odd but necessary, and already told him things about the world he was travelling to, a world in which he would break his back working. If only that work could be found, he would hold himself apart from other people, find corners and shadows in which to sit and smoke, demonstrate that he didn't need to belong, that his heart remained in his own country. Okay, so this is the 1, 2, 3. That's the 5th paragraph, and we're really starting to get to know Lev as a character much more now. His thoughts and feelings are very clearly being revealed, but they're internal. So he hasn't actually physically voiced this himself, but the narrator is letting us into Lev's head a lot more. And like I said about the lady, she is making an assumption that Lev is perhaps uneducated or perhaps unintelligent, because she doesn't even say hi or strike up a normal conversation. She's just like, oh, I'm sorry, but there's no smoking like allowed on this bus. And it's like, he knows this, but the cigarettes obviously have some kind of big symbolic meaning for him, and it's the way they use this beautiful metaphor of, but even an unlit cigarette was a companion. Sorry, my cat was just like flinching. But even an unlit cigarette was a companion, and it just shows that I mean, how lonely do you have to be in life for a cigarette to be your only form of companion? Because a cigarette is obviously not alive, it can't talk to you, and yet for him it's providing him comfort and it reminds him of his home. And it mentions about something that had promise in it. So clearly the cigarette is definitely it's definitely some kind of symbol, and we may not necessarily at this point know what that symbol is, but it's important to Lev, and as we read on we may find out why. And I really like the way it kind of shows that the intimacy that you can experience on a coach with these random strangers you've never met. You learn certain things about them, but you don't actually fully communicate or fully connect. And the whole idea that when they reach London, and we now have a new location that Lev is traveling to, so we're like, okay, he's going to London to work, and he's going to, and just the physical force of would break his back working, like that really strong verb, break. He's going to break his back working, but if only that work could be found. And the setting of how he's going to find corners and shadows in which to sit and smoke is incredibly significant. So even though Lev is going to this country, he doesn't feel it's not a joyous trip. It's not a trip that he's looking forward to. It's not something he wants to do. It's something he has to do. It's a necessity. And this kind of really drums home the fact where it talks about, and Lev thought how all of this was odd but necessary. So this is something uncomfortable for him to do, but this shows he's a very logical character. He's a very logical person. It's like, I don't want to do this, but it's something I have to do. So it's kind of sad thinking about how he's been forced to leave his home. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next paragraph. Just checking some of the things. Yeah. Okay. There were 2 coach drivers. These men would take turns to drive and to sleep. There was an onboard lavatory, which is just a nice old fancy word for bathroom, or toilet even, sorry. So the only stops the bus would make would be for gas. At gas stations, the passengers would be able to clamber off, walk a few paces, see wildflowers on a verge, soiled paper among bushes, sun or rain on the road. They might stretch up their arms, put on dark glasses against the onrush of nature's light, look for a clover leaf, smoke and stare at the cars rushing by. Then they would be herded back onto the coach, resume their old attitudes, arm themselves for the next 100 miles for the stink of another industrial zone or the sudden gleam of a lake for oh, sorry, I'm just finding where it was on the next picture. For rain and sunset and the approach of darkness and silent marshes, there would be times when the journey would seem to have no end. So this is kind of building up more of the setting again, and it's interesting how we started at the beginning of the extract with Lev leaving his hometown, and how there's like an abundance of sunflowers, even though they've been like scorched by the dry wind. They're still, it's a very sort of rural area, but now the only kind of, we're getting bits and pieces of rural, but we're slowly moving away from the countryside. And it's like how the only wildflowers that there are on the verges, which are obviously like on the side of a road, like on maybe on a motorway or something, like a main road, they're only on the verges, so they're out of reach. And how you're starting to get more of the urbanization, so you're getting like the soiled paper among bushes, sun or rain on the road. And it talks about like the industrial stink, and how when the passengers get off, they might like, it's interesting how it says like look for a clover leaf, because traditionally a clover leaf is a symbol of like good luck and hope and prosperity, technically, like good fortune, all those kinds of ideas. But it's the fact that they're looking for it, and then all you can really look at is smoke and stare at the cars rushing by. And they use very sort of animalistic terminology, like an animalistic verb to describe the passengers. So then they would be herded back onto the coach. And it's very, it kind of builds up the picture of how agonizing this journey is for Lev. It's like there would be times when the journey would seem to have no end. And it's kind of like this loss of hope, and this it's kind of just like a very sort of sad, a very poignant situation for Lev to be in. Okay, next paragraph. Sleeping upright was not something Lev was practiced in. The old seemed to be able to do it, but 42 was not yet old. Lev's father, Stefan, sometimes used to sleep upright, in summer, on a hard wooden chair in his lunch break. At the Baron sawmill, sorry, I can't really pronounce that, sawmill, with the hot sun falling onto the slices of sausage wrapped in paper on his knee and onto his flask of tea, both Stefan and Lev could sleep lying down on a mound of hay or on the mossy carpet of a forest. Often Lev had slept on a rag rug beside his daughter's bed when she was ill or afraid, and when his wife Marina was dying, he'd lain for 5 nights on an area of linoleum for flooring no wider than his outstretched arm, between Marina's hospital bed and a curtain patterned with pink and purple daisies, and sleep had come and gone in a mystifying kind of way, painting strange pictures in Lev's brain that had never completely vanished. Okay, so now we're even learning more about Lev's background and how he had a wife who died, and he watched that and he had to witness that, and now there's the question of like, where's his daughter? He's left his daughter behind, which is very sad. So he's obviously not traveling with his daughter, so we can only assume that she's been left home, and potentially the Russian packet of cigarettes, and looking at some of the names, I'm starting to assume, although obviously I don't know this for certain, I'm starting to guess that he has come from somewhere connected to Russia or some part of Russia. And Lev sounds like quite a sort of Russian name, but I don't want to obviously assume Lev's nationality because it hasn't explicitly said that he is Russian. So and we're kind of like, I guess it's almost building up this idea that Lev is he's trying so hard to hold on to what he has, but it's this kind of idea like sleeping upright was not something Lev was practicing. The old seemed to be able to do it, but 42 was not yet old, and he's sort of thinking about his father, how he used to be able to sleep upright in the summer, and the fact that his dad comes from quite a working class background is significant too. So it's kind of like this continuation of a generation. Like Lev himself, he hasn't been able to progress on the kind of work area that his father used to do. His father used to work in a sawmill, which is kind of a very sort of traditional sort of working class area to be in. It's like manual labor, hard graft, hard labor. And the fact that Lev is now having to travel to London to find opportunities, it's kind of like this full circle of family history. So Lev wasn't able to find where he was living, he wasn't able to find a better job. And obviously his wife was very ill, so that would have been putting a lot of pressure on him. And it also shows the compassion and the love that Lev has for his family, where it describes often Lev had slept on a rag rug beside his daughter's bed when she was ill or afraid. So he lets his daughter have the bed, and it kind of paints a picture of the fact that they're probably a very sort of poverty stricken family. They don't have much, but the bed that they do have, Lev is giving that to his young daughter. He is willing to sleep on the floor for his family, and it shows he's a very maybe family orientated man. So this kind of adds even more layers of poignancy to the fact that Lev has to travel and leave his daughter behind. Towards this next paragraph now, towards evening, after 2 stops for gas, the mole-flecked woman unwrapped a hard-boiled egg. She peeled it silently. The smell of the egg reminded Lev of the sulphur springs at I don't know how to pronounce that, where he'd taken Marina, just in case nature could cure what man had given up for lost. Marina had immersed her body obediently in the scummy water, laying there looking at a female stork returning to its highness, and said to Lev, "If only we were storks." Okay, this is getting even more emotional now. So this is really interesting how this is kind of like a flashback that Lev is having, and it's been spurred on by like this sulfury smelling egg. So they obviously, when Lev and his wife went on a pilgrimage to try and cure her, and it kind of almost suggests that Lev, maybe he used to have some kind of faith. And the idea of storks is very significant because I can't remember if it's Japanese. You might have to look it up. I can't remember what country it comes from, but there's folklore regarding storks, and storks are a symbol of, not only do we have our sort of idea of like, oh yeah, babies are delivered by storks, and it's kind of like the idea of new life and new beginnings, but there is, I can't remember what country it's from, but there is folklore to do with storks that I learnt about, and it's this idea that they're meant to be almost like immortal, or like they have this idea of resurrection linked with them. And his wife is saying like, if only we were storks. And then Lev is saying, why do you say that? Lev had asked. Because you never see a stork dying. It's as though they didn't die. If only, and then it just repeats, but this isn't dialogue, it's just, if only we were storks. So potentially Lev himself is wishing this. He doesn't want to lose his wife. He wants her to obviously live, and he loves her. And then it says, on the woman's knee, a clean cotton napkin was spread, and her white hand smoothed it, and she unwrapped rye bread and a twist of salt. My name is Lev, said Lev. My name is Lydia, said the woman, and they shook hands. Lev's hand holding the scrunched up kerchief, and Lydia's hand roughed with salt and smelling of egg. And then Lev asked, what are you planning to do in England? And Lydia said, I have some interviews in London for jobs as a translator. That sounds promising. I hope so. I was a teacher of English at school 237 in Yarble, so my language is very colloquial. Lev looked at Lydia. It wasn't difficult to imagine her standing in front of a class and writing words on a blackboard. He said, I wonder why you're leaving our country when you had a good job at school 237 or 237 in Yarble. Well, said Lydia, I became very tired of the view from my window. Every day, summer and winter, I looked out at the schoolyard and the high fence and the apartment block beyond, and I began to imagine I would die seeing these things, and I didn't want this. I expect you understand what I mean. So this is interesting. It's starting to make a comparison between two different characters of Lev and Lydia. It's like Lydia had a very safe job, you could say, because there's always going to be a need for teachers. There's always a need for education. So Lydia kind of had potentially not necessarily not like a well-off life, but in comparison to Lev, she probably had a lot more. So Lev is probably thinking, why have you given this up if you had a good job? Like, why take the risk? And it's almost like making the comparison that for Lydia, this is almost like an opportunity she is able to pursue, and she doesn't really have anything to lose. Whereas for Lev, he had to leave his, like, we don't know if his dad is alive or not. Potentially he isn't, because it described he used to sleep upright in a chair, but we don't know that for certain. But he has definitely left his daughter behind, or he's definitely left his family behind. So for Lev, this is probably, and it's like, once again, it's this kind of idea of assumptions. Like, I expect you understand what I mean. It's like, no, because he doesn't want to leave his home, but he has to. So it then says Lev took off his leather cap and ran his fingers through his thick grey hair. And once again, it's almost like this idea that Lev is old before his time. His life has been hard, and he is suffering emotionally with this journey, and he has thick grey hair, and he's only 40, I think he's almost 43 or 42 or whatever it says in the text. So he's kind of old before his time. He saw Lydia turn to him for a moment and look very seriously into his eyes. He said, yes, I understand. So even though he understands, even though he says that, we can kind of assume that he's just being polite, because we know why Lev is travelling to London, and it's not like an optimistic journey of like, oh yeah, I'm going to make a better life for myself. It's just a harsh necessity. But he can understand Lydia's point of view. So once again, it shows that Lev is a very sort of rational and compassionate character, and he's not really begrudging Lydia for making any assumptions. He's just kind of like, yes, I understand. And he'd probably, if he was in her situation, he probably might have done the similar thing, but he would have probably been able to take his family. Then there was a silence, while Lydia ate her hard-boiled egg. I'm sorry, this video is going to be so long. She chewed very quietly. When she finished the egg, Lev said, "My English isn't too bad. I took some classes in Barin, but my teacher told me my pronunciation wasn't very good. May I say some words and you can tell me if I'm pronouncing them correctly?" Oh, this just really shows his dialogue, really shows his character just shines through. He's willing to learn. He wants to become a better person, potentially for his family, and he's willing to learn. He's willing to do whatever it takes. And this actually shows how intelligent Lev is to make that connection. Like, oh, she works in the educational field. She could help me. Yes, of course, said Lydia. Lev said, "Lovely. Sorry. I am legal." I'll get to that bit in a sec. "How much, please? Thank you. May you help me?" "Oh, may I help you?" corrected Lydia. "May I help you?" repeated Lev. Oh, and this is a really lovely stylistic device. They're kind of using like for the "may you help me," that's like technically incorrect grammar, but that's obviously because Lev comes from a different culture and a different part in the world, and his grammatical structure in English wouldn't necessarily be obviously that of a native speaker. So that's kind of showing the cultural differences. Even if Lydia's come from the same place, if she's a teacher, she would have learned like the correct structure and everything. So that's a really lovely stylistic device that's been used to kind of really emphasize the fact that Lev doesn't have the educational background of the country he is going towards. But what really hurts is that really short, snappy, these words he's saying, and the one where he says, "I am legal." So that kind of raises a whole different issue of this kind of idea that, unfortunately, in Britain, not everywhere is incredibly tolerant of different cultures, which I have a massive issue with. But anyway, let's not get into politics or anything like that, because that's just a whole nother issue. But the fact that he is practicing the phrase, say, "I am legal," he's basically trying to tell people that I have travelled here legally. I'm not in your country illegally. I need a job. And that's just a whole nother issue that I don't, but you can tell how not touchy, but how relevant this extract is, and how relevant it's just kind of like Lev is just trying to prepare himself. It shows he is aware of how other people may perceive him being a immigrant traveling to a foreign country. But it's just so sad. He shouldn't have to worry about that, but anyway. "Go on," said Lydia. "Stork," said Lev. "Stork's nest. Rain. I am lost. I wish for an interpreter. B and B and B." So that's another phonic device they've used. So B, in Lev's dialogue, it's actually written as the animal bee, like B and B. And then Lydia's like, "B and B?" said Lydia. No, you mean to be or not to be," which is obviously a quote from Shakespeare's famous play, Hamlet. "To be or not to be?" And it's like, no, Lev isn't talking about that. He's talking about like an actual breakfast B&B. And it's like, "No," said Lev. "B and B, family hotel, quite cheap." "Oh, yes, I know. B and B." So it's like trying to help him with stuff like that. But it's really sad how the stork, that symbol, is really important to note when things are repeated in a text. And the idea of a stork has come up again. And it's how it's like stork, stork's nest, rain, I am lost. It's kind of like this. It's almost like really interesting how his thought process is working. And you could almost like connect those two ideas together. Like he's just trying to say words and phrases in English, but it's the fact that he mentions stork's nest and then the rain and then I am lost, and you can almost imagine that he may not necessarily literally mean, he may not be trying to practice that phrase, "I am lost." It could be it's emotionally connected to the stork that he's just mentioned, and he's thinking of his wife who he lost. So Lev is metaphorically lost. He's emotionally lost without his family. Lev could now see that darkness was falling outside the window, and he thought how, in his village, darkness had always arrived in precisely the same way, from the same direction, above the same trees, whether early or late, whether in summer, winter, or spring, for the whole of his life. This darkness, particular to that place, Auror, I cannot say any of these words, was how, in Lev's heart, darkness would always fall. And so he told Lydia that he came from Auror, had worked in the Baryin sawmill until it closed 2 years ago. So he worked where his dad worked. And since then he'd found no work at all, and his family, oh God, his mother, his 5-year-old daughter, and he had lived off the money his mother made selling jewellery manufactured from tin. So yeah, he's definitely had a very hard life. And it's not a fact that Lev is a lazy character. He was made redundant because the sawmill that his own father had worked at, once again, this idea of generational history and how history is repeating itself, the sawmill closed down, so he was made redundant. He was forced out of work. It wasn't by choice. And then things just kind of went downhill. And it's like this, the imagery or the setting of darkness, and this kind of idea that darkness, it was very sort of a temporal, like a time related thing where he comes from. And it's kind of like, obviously, time zone differences. It's kind of like he's noticing outside the coach that now it's starting to get dark. And so even the darkness is now becoming unknown to Lev and unfamiliar. Oh, said Lydia, I think that's very resourceful, to make jewellery from tin. Okay, Lydia. Sure, sure, said Lev, but it isn't enough. It's like, why would you make that comment, Lydia? But okay. So we can really see in comparison that Lydia doesn't really have a filter. So we're assuming that Lydia is the same passenger that we meet in the beginning, where she makes the assumption and says to Lev, oh, you can't smoke on this bus. And I don't know, it's just kind of like, it just shows once again how Lev is a very compassionate character. Lydia is not very tactful by saying, I think that's very resourceful to make jewellery from tin. It's like, why would you even, it's just no. It's just, yes, it may be resourceful, but that's not something he would say. It's not very considerate to Lev or his like, it's just very tragic. Like, he's just revealed something very, although he hasn't actually, and actually, that's really interesting. So we get the description, but Lev hasn't actually physically, so we can assume that Lev told her about it. Yeah, sorry. And so he told Lydia that he came from, but it's interesting how it's done through the narration. It's like telling you that he's told her rather than the actual dialogue, which almost makes it even more powerful. Because then for Lydia to react in that way, it's kind of like, you're majorly missing the point. He's lost his entire family. He's left his entire family behind. And all you can say is, oh, it's very resourceful to make jewellery from tin. So tucked into his boot was a small flask of vodka. He extracted the flask and took a long swig. Nice. Lydia kept eating her rye bread. Lev wiped his mouth with a red handkerchief and saw his face reflected in the coach window. He looked away. Since the death of Marina, he didn't like to catch sight of his own reflection. Oh, Lev! Because what he always saw in it was his own guilt at still being alive. So this is really starting to build up the emotional layers of Lev. He's obviously drinking. Tucked into his boot was a small flask of vodka, and even though it's a small flask, vodka is a very strong alcoholic drink, so we can kind of gain the sense that emotionally Lev isn't necessarily coping that well, and how he can't even look at his own reflection because of the guilt he feels. So he feels responsible for his wife's death, even though we know it's not his fault because she had some kind of illness that he just couldn't help, but he feels guilt, so potentially maybe he couldn't afford medical care or something, or it just shows that, once again, it just really drives the home that Lev is a wonderfully compassionate character and he feels guilty for his wife's death. Why did the sawmill at Barron close? Lydia! This woman is so nosy, it's awful. Why did the sawmill at Baryon close? Asked Lydia. They ran out of trees, said Lev. Oh, that's an interesting one. So that's raising another new issue of, like, industrialization and global warming and deforestation and all that kind of stuff. Very bad, said Lydia. What other work can you do? Lev drank again. Someone had told him that in England vodka was too expensive to drink. Oh God, yeah, because you don't even think about all that. The fact that he is trying to make it on his own in this new country, currency is going to be completely different. And I mean, if things were expensive for him back home, moving to England and London, oh God, London especially, London is like so expensive. So it's like, what hope does he have? And it's almost like he's enjoying his last little bit of home with the vodka. Immigrants made their own alcohol from potatoes and tap water. When Lev thought about these industrious immigrants, he imagined them sitting by a coal fire in a tall house, talking and laughing, with rain falling outside the window and red buses going past and the television flickering in a corner of the room. He sighed and said, "I will do any work at all. My daughter Maya needs clothes, shoes, books, toys, everything. England is my hope." Oh, love. So once again, it's just showing this is the real reason why he's going. He's going for his daughter. He's had to leave his little girl behind, motherless, but potentially Lev's mother, her grandmother, is still there taking care of her. Because we know Lev is a compassionate character, so he hasn't just like abandoned his daughter lightheartedly, and we can assume that she's in safe hands, otherwise Lev probably wouldn't have left. But this kind of idea that he wants a better life for his daughter, and now we've really grasped the fact that this is what drives Lev. He wants to provide for his daughter. England is his only hope. Towards 10 o'clock, red blankets were given out to the coach passengers, some of whom were already sleeping. Lydia put away the remnants of her meal, covered her body with the blanket, and switched on a fierce little light above her under the baggage rack, and began reading a faded old paperback printed in English. Lev saw that the title of her book was The Power and the Glory. His longing for a cigarette had grown steadily since he'd drunk the vodka, and now it was acute. He could feel the yearning in his lungs and in his blood, and his hands grew fidgety, and he felt a tremor in his legs. How long before the next gas stop? It could be 4 or 5 hours. Everyone on the bus would be asleep by then, except him and one of two drivers. So we can tell that smoking is something that helps Lev cope, potentially emotionally. So he's starting to have that almost like withdrawal symptoms. If you smoke frequently, the nicotine, you need it. So it's kind of like he's getting twitchy and he needs a cigarette. Only they would keep a lonely, exhausting vigil, the driver's body tense to the moods and alarms of the dark, unravelling road, his own aching for the comfort of nicotine or oblivion, and getting neither. Oh, Lev. So it's interesting. Once again, this kind of idea of religious imagery is cropping up and religious use of language. So vigil is quite a sort of holy, almost like a kind of, if you keep vigil, you keep watch, but the word vigil has quite holy connotations. And that kind of links back to the idea of a pilgrimage, like you see it through. And this is an exhausting vigil, like the drivers and everything like that. And it's also interesting earlier on how it kind of made the comparison, like a group of immigrants. Once again, we really get the sense that Lev is isolated. So other immigrants, they have each other, they have a family, they have a kind of group that they travel with, but Lev is completely on his own. He envied Lydia. Oh, and this is interesting because earlier on I sort of had this idea that Lev wasn't a touchy character, but it's kind of like he keeps all these kind of the negative emotions inside. But now we're finally seeing he envied Lydia, immersed in her English book. Lev knew he had to distract himself with something. In desperation, he took from his wallet a brand new British £20 note and reached up and switched on his own little reading light and began to examine the note. On one side, the frumpy the frumpy Queen E2R. That's interesting. So obviously he may not even know Queen Elizabeth's name. With her diadem, her face grey on a purple ground, and on the other a man, some personage from the past, with a dark drooping moustache and an angel blowing a trumpet above him, and all the angels' radiance falling on him in vertical lines. So once again, the idea of religious imagery coming through. The British venerate their history, Lev had been told in his English class, chiefly because they have never been subjected to occupation. That's fair point. Only intermittently do they see that some of their past deeds were not good. That is very true. Once again, it's kind of showing all these bigger issues at play, like imperialism, which is basically like where another country takes over another country, and this idea that you are the most important nation, and all these negative, silly things that humans do for stupid reasons. it's really interesting how Lev is kind of looking at it, and he's recalling his own education, and he's been taught that Britain is not such a nice place, and chiefly because they've never been subjected to occupation. So there, it's making the point that Britain is the one who occupies other countries. And I mean, imagine learning in your class about a country that does horrible things, and then sometimes only intermittently, so only every now and again, do they see that some of their past deeds were not good. And that, imagine learning about that in your class, and now you're forced to go to that country. You'd probably be absolutely petrified. The indicated lifespan of the man on the note was 1857 to 1934. I think it might be Darwin. Potentially, it might be Darwin. They've kind of changed the notes, like the people on the notes now, so I can't even remember who we have now, but I have a feeling that might have been Darwin, who's like obviously came up with the theory of evolution, Victorian scientist. He looks like a banker, but what had he done to be on a £20 note in the 21st century? Yeah, I reckon it's probably Darwin. Lev stared at his determined jaw, squinted at his name, written out in a scrawl beneath the wing collar, but he couldn't read it. He thought that this was a person who would never have known any other system of being alive but capitalism. He would have heard the names Hitler and Stalin, but not been afraid, would have no need to be afraid of anything except a little loss of capital and what Americans called the crash, when men in New York had jumped out of windows and off roofs. That's interesting. That's bringing context into it. That's like referring to the Great Depression. He would have died safely in his bed before London was bombed to ruins, before Europe was torn apart, right to the end of his days. The angel's radiance had probably shone on this man's brow and on his fusty clothes, because it was known across the world. Wish we're lucky. Well fought, Lev. Fought Lev. I'm going to their country now, and I'm going to make them share it with me, their infernal luck. I've left Auror, and that leaving of my home was hard and bitter, but my time is coming. So it's interesting how, after all the poignant kind of atmosphere that's happened, Lev is finally left with this determination and this optimism, and like he's like, well, I am going to this country and I am going to make it. And it's kind of this idea that he thinks the English are lucky, so he's hoping he can take that luck and turn it into something positive. I hope this video has helped. If anyone has any questions, please leave a comment below, and I'm going to try and make another video for the other texts in the anthology as well. Anyway, thank you. Bye.